Here is how Pericles, the influential Athenian statesman and orator who lived in the 5th century BCE, praised the form of government the city of Athens had instituted. The speech is credited to him by the ancient Greek historian Thucydides and was delivered to his fellow citizens in the midst of a devastating war. Our form of government does not enter into rivalry with the institutions of others. We do not copy our neighbours, but are an example to them. It is true that we are called a democracy, for the administration is in the hands of the many and not of the few. But while the law secures equal justice to all alike in their private disputes, the claim of excellence is also recognised. And when a citizen is in any way distinguished, he is preferred to the public service, not as a matter of privilege, but as the reward of merit. Neither is poverty a bar, but a man may benefit his country, whatever be the obscurity of his condition. There is no exclusiveness in our public life. Welcome to this lecture on the civilization of classical Greece and on the various experiments the Greeks carried out in how to effectively govern a complex state for the benefit of all its citizens. As we have seen time and again, it is geography and the environment that often dictate the cultural and historical evolution of civilizations, both ancient and modern. And this is certainly the case with the Greeks. But as we will see in this lecture, the genius of the system of government that the Greeks developed made it both adaptable and inspirational to cultures around the world. Greece is essentially made up of a mainland region that juts into the Mediterranean and also of thousands of islands. The mainland is a mountainous peninsula, roughly the size of the US state of Maine, and its rugged mountain interior made internal communications difficult. So the cities that eventually emerged on the mainland were isolated from each other to the extent that throughout the long history of ancient Greece, they generally preferred to remain independent. There was never any such thing as a Greek empire then, although different states would form alliances in times of conflict. Along the west coast of the peninsula, the mountains fall so steeply into the sea that there are no safe harbours. But much of the rest of the mainland is indented with natural harbours, particularly the east coast and the land south of the Gulf of Corinth, the Peloponnesus. The Peloponnesus was very nearly an island connected to the rest of the mainland only by a small spit of land near Corinth. In fact, the word Peloponnesus means Pelops Island. It was named for the mythological king Pelops, who ruled the Greek city of Pisa. Today, after the digging of the Corinth Canal, the Peloponnesus really is an island. The challenges of travel in the Greek interior and the nature of the region's coastline acted as a natural encouragement to the development of robust maritime trade and communication by sea. Indeed, the Greeks were a superb maritime people. Another geographical feature of critical importance to Greek history is the serious lack of arable land in the country, and this forced the mainland city-states to establish colonies abroad, both to serve as supplementary sources of food and to provide more space for rapidly increasing populations. Because of its geography and the widespread unrest across the eastern Mediterranean during the so-called Greek Dark Ages, from roughly 1100 to 800 BCE, no central power emerged in the region during this period. Instead, it was left up to local institutions to try and restore civil society. In the context of this ongoing conflict, it's hardly surprising that the most common local institution to emerge towards the end of this period was the polis, a Greek word for a fortified citadel that offered refuge for surrounding communities when needed. What is remarkable, however, is the new species of political system that evolved in the polis, the plural for polis, over time. Because they were defensible and strategically located, these polis began to attract larger and denser populations, becoming increasingly urbanized commercial and political centers that took control of surrounding regions. To support the functions of government, elites within the polis extracted tribute from the hinterlands in the form of a proportion of agricultural surplus, and much like the early Mesopotamian city-states, this tribute was used to support urban populations. By 800 BCE, many mainland polis had evolved into bustling city-states which functioned as the principal centers of Greek civilization throughout its history. The next century was characterized by political tension in the polis after elite noble classes gained power. They established an aristocracy, a Greek word that means government by the best, or an oligarchy, government by the few. The elites also abolished most popular assemblies and reduced commoners to a state of virtual serfdom. But over the century that followed, increasing maritime trade in pottery, textiles, and wine, and the minting of the first coinage in the world to facilitate these commercial transactions led to the emergence of a new middle class that began to challenge the elite monopoly on power. At the same time, with arable land in short supply, rising populations put increasing pressure on resources, which is why many polis established overseas colonies, encouraging commoners to resettle as a safety valve against potential political unrest. We know of at least 400 Greek colonies that were established in the region between 750 and 550 on the Ionian coast of modern Turkey, the coasts of modern Spain, France, Italy, and Egypt, and also along the shores of the Black Sea. Greek colonization did help temporarily ease political tensions within the polis, and it had the larger effect of intensifying commercial and cultural exchange between the various peoples that lived in these regions and spreading Greek language and culture. Yet, despite the establishment of these colonies, political unrest continued to ferment as both commoners and middle class chafed at the power and political presumptions of the nobility. Soon after 650, political revolutions broke out in several of the polis, leading to the appearance of a new type of ruler known as a tyrant, another Greek word that means one who usurps power. Many tyrants seize power with the explicit support of the poor and middle class, then pass laws to redistribute land to the poor and promote commerce and economic development. They also encouraged middle-class citizens to take a larger role in civic and military life, leading to the creation of a new heavily armed citizen-based military force, the soldiers of which were known as hoplites. In this environment of political and military reform, new ideas about the best way to organize and govern a society were constantly swirling about. Perhaps nothing demonstrates the wide variety of these political ideas better than the restructuring undertaken in two of the most powerful polis, Athens and Sparta. The early Athenian political system resembled that of the other polis. The assembly of the people was marginalized and nobles were in power in the form of a group of 9 magistrates called archons, or rulers. The original archons appear to have had little interest in protecting the commoners, and as small farmers and the urban poor became landless, they fell into debt slavery. Pressure to relieve this situation built up to dangerous levels until the Athenian elites reluctantly agreed to reform. At the beginning of the 6th century, Athenian nobles accepted a compromise put forward by one of their own, an aristocrat named Solon, who was named sole archon in 594 BCE. Solon immediately introduced a series of sensible reforms, cancelling lower-class debt, banning debt slavery, and opening up membership of the ruling council to men of wealth, not just noble birth. Not everyone in Athens was happy with Solon's reforms, particularly the nobility. Political unrest broke out again, and Athens fell into anarchy until another tyrant, Pisistratus, seized power in 560. Pisistratus' rule proved more satisfactory to all classes of Athenian society. He was also a generous patron of the arts, which helped engender a serious appreciation of art and culture that would bear spectacular fruit in the century that followed. The sons of Pisistratus were cut from a different cloth to their father, however. Their brutal, tyrannical rule was only ended when another tyrant, Cleisthenes, seized power. If Athens deserves its reputation as the cradle of democracy, the system of government that Pericles lauded in his speech, much of the credit is owed to Cleisthenes. In a series of sweeping reforms passed between 508 and 502, Cleisthenes reduced the political power of the nobility, reorganized Athenian citizens into 10 tribes, gave the popular assembly the right to pass laws, and set up a new form of government, a council of 500 representative leaders elected by lot. The Athenians called this new form of government democracy, a word coined from 2 separate Greek words, Demos, which means the people, and kratos, which means power. In essence, the system of government put in place in Athens at the very beginning of the 5th century was power to the people. Democratic government in Athens proved itself capable of producing great elected leaders like Pericles, who insisted that it was now a citizen's duty to participate in political life. Indeed, the modern word idiot comes from the Greek word idiotes, used to describe a private man who did not participate in politics. But democracy also came in for harsh criticism from the historian Thucydides and the philosopher Aristotle, both of whom equated it with rule by the mob. It was only in the early modern era that British thinkers like Thomas Macaulay and John Stuart Mill started making strong arguments in the defense of democracy in the hope that its implementation in Britain would lead to a shared sense of civic consciousness similar to that achieved in ancient Athens. Meanwhile, the city-state of Sparta, located in the fertile central region of the Peloponnesus, also developed a species of democracy, although it arrived at this via a very different set of circumstances. Faced with a growing population in the 8th and 7th centuries, the Spartans decided to use their military to extend control over the Peloponnesus. They then came up with an effective, though brutal, plan of destroying the power of the neighboring Messenian city-state and reducing its population to slavery. The role of these slaves, known as the Helots, was to provide free agricultural labor and keep the Spartans supplied with food. But there was one big problem with this plan. The population of the Helots increased at a much faster rate than that of the Spartans, until eventually they were outnumbered by 8-1. Faced with the constant threat of rebellion, Spartan leaders decided to focus their city's energies on maintaining a powerful military, essentially turning their polis into a militarized totalitarian state to ensure against Helot revolution. In the mid-7th century, Sparta transitioned from monarchy to oligarchy, but at the same time, the Spartans also created a popular assembly that gave all citizens the right to elect their leaders, known as ephors, and also the right to approve or veto proposals coming from Sparta's Council of Elders. Most male Spartans were expected to devote themselves to rigorous military training. Boys who were sickly or who had some physical problem were abandoned at birth. And at the age of 7, all males were placed under the charge of tough state educators. At age 20, these men were enrolled in the army, leaving their homes to live in military barracks. These soldiers were permitted to marry at the age of 30, although they were only allowed to visit their wives at night. Those who survived the tough training and the constant battles these soldiers found themselves in for the next 40 years were allowed to retire from military service at the age of 60. Now, many Greeks admired the formidable Spartan soldiers, but others, including the Athenians, saw the Spartans as uncultured brutes who were good for only one thing: fighting. As Athens, Sparta, and other mainland Greek polis prospered in their own ways, Greek colonies and merchants continued to gain prominence in the Mediterranean and Black Sea basins, from Spain in the west to Crimea in the east. It was this expansion of Greek interests that eventually brought the Greeks into conflict with the rapidly expanding Persian Empire. The protracted conflict between the Greeks and Persians, which lasted for nearly 3 decades, is known to history as the Persian Wars, thanks mostly to the superb account of the conflict written by the great 5th century BCE Athenian historian Herodotus. The spark that ignited the conflict was an aggressive move by the Persian king Darius to incorporate the prosperous Greek colonies into the Persian Empire by force. The colonies revolted in 499 and appealed to their fellow Greeks for help. In response, Athens sent ships and burned the Persian city of Sardis, invoking a furious Persian response. Persian King Darius sent 20,000 troops across the Aegean in the year 490 BCE in an attempt to force the Athenians to accept a pro-Persian tyrant. The Persian fleet landed at Marathon, but on a hot August day, the Greeks outflanked the Persians, forcing them to retreat to their ships with the loss of some 6,400 men. This is the victory that, according to the ancient Roman source Lucian, inspired the Athenian herald Phidippides to run 40 kilometers or 24 miles from Marathon to Athens to announce victory to the Athenians, only to collapse and die after doing so. And that act, of course, gave rise to the extended foot race known as the Marathon today. 10 years later, the new Persian king Xerxes launched a second campaign, dispatching possibly the largest force ever assembled to that point in history across the swift-flowing water at the Hellespont, the narrow strait between Asia Minor and Europe. To make the crossing, the Persian army constructed 2 pontoon bridges, a remarkable engineering achievement, marched over them, and then headed down the coast towards Athens, accompanied by a formidable fleet of 350 ships. Now, Athens hastily assembled its own fleet of 200 warships, while Sparta formalized a defensive alliance of 31 states. A force of 300 Spartans, supported by several hundred allied troops, prepared to confront the massive Persian army at a narrow pass at Thermopylae, which means the Hot Gates. The Spartans chose well because the Hot Gates gave them several geographical advantages to defend against an enormously larger force. The pass was only about 45 feet wide, was protected on the left flanked by a sheer cliff and on the right by the sea. The battle between the two forces also represented 2 quite different military strategies. The Persians preferred to use archers to fire volleys of arrows at their enemies, then followed this up with a cavalry charge. But the Greeks relied on their hoplite forces, organized into a densely packed phalanx formation to fight at close quarters, with each soldier carrying a heavy bronze shield, short sword, and a long spear. Although the Persian military strategy had allowed them to create the largest empire in world history, the particular geographical circumstances of Thermopylae were much better suited to the Greek formation. For 2 days, the much smaller Greek force held the 80,000 plus Persians at bay, but late in the second day, a Greek traitor revealed to the Persians a narrow path that circumvented the pass. On the third day of the battle, the surviving Spartans and a small number of their allies fought a valiant last stand, determined to buy the Greek forces further south the time to prepare for the Persian onslaught. The Spartans and their allies all died, but have been immortalized ever since in Western culture for the courage of their stand against overwhelming odds. The Persian forces, delayed but not defeated, continued down the coast and sacked the polis of Athens. But at the ensuing Battle of Salamis, the ships of the outnumbered Athenian navy, with the assistance of some very fortuitous winds, managed to destroy the Persian fleet, and the Persians were effectively driven out of Greece forever. Despite the courage of the Spartans at Thermopylae, it was Athens that emerged as the de facto leader of the Greek world after the defeat of the Persians. And during the ensuing Golden Age, Greek civilization went on to achieve the fullest development of its genius. Although Athens was governed by a board of 10 elected generals for more than 30 years, the great statesman Pericles wielded tremendous personal influence. Much like modern democratic governments, the success or failure of the policies of the elected governing board meant that they would be judged by the popular assembly and either re-elected or thrown out. While it's true that even the poorest citizen had a vote in Athens, we do need to qualify the reality of Athenian democracy. All citizens could vote, but there were several categories of residents who could not. The large slave population, all resident aliens, and perhaps most significantly, all Athenian women. According to law, women were the legal property of their husbands, and their role was clearly prescribed: to bear children, to manage the household, and to disappear when their husbands entertained friends, including other lovers, male or female. Marriages were mostly arranged, men at the age of 30 and girls in their early teens, and families were kept small by the practice of infanticide, particularly of unwanted female babies. While Athenian women had almost no chance to participate in public life and led lives of seclusion, locked in their homes and forbidden to speak to men outside the family, things were very different in the rigid, militarized society of Sparta. Because Spartan authorities hoped their women would bear strong sons for the military, the state prescribed vigorous physical exercise for girls. Like boys, they trained naked in public or wore tunics that allowed for little modesty. By the time they became women, they were very fit and had completely bought into the military ethos of the state. As the men headed off to battle, Spartan women were heard to cry as they lined the streets, "Come back bearing your shield or being carried on it." That is, come back a winner or dead. In Sparta, women were older at marriage, around 18. They were permitted to own property and manage their own households, and they had the right to take another husband if their first was away at war too long. But I don't want to exaggerate the differences between the lives of women in Sparta and Athens. Spartan women were still under the control of males, and Athenian tombstones demonstrate that many married Athenians were genuinely happy and devoted to each other. I also don't want to exaggerate the virtues of Athenian society, impressive as its democracy was. Slavery was a common feature in all Greek polis, including Athens. As many as 20% of the residents of Athens were slaves who had been brought to the city by slave dealers to work as agricultural or manufacturing laborers. Most Athenians seem to have agreed with the philosopher Aristotle, who argued that non-Greeks were incapable of human reason and needed the guidance of a Greek master. As Aristotle put it, slavery was part of the natural order of society. For that some should rule and others be ruled is a thing not only necessary, but expedient. From the hour of their birth, some are marked out for subjection, others for rule. Ultimately, the triumphs and failures of classical Greek society ended in bitter self-destruction through civil war. Although the Persians had been driven out of mainland Greece, they still ruled many Greek colonies along the Ionian coast. The Athenians addressed the situation by establishing a defensive alliance of several of the Aegean city-states, the Delian League, in 478 BCE. Sparta, for its part, returned to its preferred policy of isolationism. From the beginning, Athens dominated the Delian League, insisting that the Allied states pay large amounts of cash to Athens so that she could maintain her navy and thus protect members of the League in case of renewed conflict with the Persians. But what many allies resented as the years went by, with no further outbreak of hostilities with the Persians, was that the coins they were paying to Athens were really being used to finance Athenian building projects. Even after 468, when the Ionian colonies were freed from the Persian yoke and the Persian fleet destroyed, the Athenians refused to disband the Delian League, transforming it into a quasi-empire with Athens as the leader. Resentment grew stronger during the 32-year reign of Pericles, when Delian League contributions were used, some would say stolen, to partly finance the massive and very expensive construction projects that so characterized this golden Athenian age, and would so astonish visitors to Athens even today, projects such as the Acropolis. Pericles justified Athenian imperialism by arguing that having a strong Athens meant that all of Greece was free from fear of outside invasion. And he justified his building projects by arguing that construction of the Acropolis would result in a building whose magnificence and breathtaking architectural brilliance would forever glorify the prestige of the city and its allies. As Pericles put it, all kinds of enterprises should be created which will provide an inspiration for every art. We must devote ourselves to acquiring things that will be the source of everlasting fame. The construction of the centerpiece of the project, the temple known as the Parthenon, was personally supervised by Pericles, and he spared no expense. Records indicate an enormous cost of 5,000 talents, that is close to $7 billion today, just in the first year, and the building took 15 years to complete. Now, those of us who have seen the Parthenon would readily agree that Pericles succeeded in creating magnificent architecture that has indeed been a source of everlasting fame for Athenian brilliance ever since. But other Greek city-states that were not in the Delian League were unimpressed and began to ally themselves with Sparta in a new power bloc that came to be known as the Spartan League. They argued that Athens was acting like a tyrant city. In 431 BCE, tension between Sparta and Athens reached boiling point, and Sparta declared war on Athens. The war would drag on for 27 years and was superbly catalogued by Thucydides in his account of the conflict, the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides was a wealthy Athenian who was appointed as a general in the early stage of the war, but because he was blamed for a disastrous loss of territory to the Spartans in 423, he was sent into exile. As an exile from Athens, he was now able to move freely amongst the Peloponnesian allied states, giving him the unique opportunity to view the conflict from the point of view of both principal protagonists. Because of this, his work has been viewed ever since as relatively objective and politically realistic, particularly because he ascribed the events in the war to human decisions without resorting to interventions by the gods to explain them. During the first phase of the war, Thucydides reports, the Spartan strategy was to send troops to invade the plains of Attica in the north, while the Athenians used their navy to raid the coastal allies of Sparta in the Peloponnesus. In only the second year of the war, a deadly plague broke out in Athens, which killed a third of the population. Soon after Pericles delivered the speech with which I began this lecture, he succumbed to the plague as well. The devastation of the plague had military implications. Athenian manpower was drastically reduced, although some Spartan soldiers refused to fight in case they came into contact with disease-carrying enemy troops. The indecisive conflict dragged on for 8 more years until a treaty was signed in 421, which included a 50-year pact of non-aggression and concluded the first phase of the war. In the end, the treaty held for 6 years, but war parties in both Athens and Sparta kept resentment on the boil, particularly a hot-headed kinsman of Pericles named Alcibiades. Alcibiades tried to force the neutral island of Melos to join the Athenian Empire. When the Molossians refused, he executed all the men and sold the women and children into slavery, outraging the Greek world. War resumed in 415 when the Athenians received word that one of their allied colonies in Sicily was under attack from the city-state of Syracuse, a Spartan ally. The Athenians felt obliged to assist their ally and sent Alcibiades and their forces on what turned out to be an utterly disastrous expedition against Syracuse. Alcibiades soon defected to the Spartan side, leaving a general named Nicias to lead an Athenian force of 100 ships, about 5,000 troops, and a small cavalry unit. Procrastination by Nicias meant that virtually nothing was accomplished during the expedition's first season, and when reinforcements arrived the following spring, poor decisions made by the Athenian leaders resulted in the utter defeat of the Athenians in a great sea battle in Syracuse harbor. The Athenian troops marched inland where they were ruthlessly hunted down and destroyed by the Syracusan cavalry, events described by Thucydides in painful, gut-wrenching detail. The Athenians managed to recover from this disaster, and political revolution in the city saw a group of 400 oligarchs placed in power, under whose leadership Athens won several victories and recovered much of its territory. But the Spartans ended up winning the final decisive conflict of the war when in 405 their brilliant commander Lysander annihilated the Athenian fleet in a great sea battle, sinking 168 Athenian ships and capturing thousands of sailors. Athens was utterly defeated and surrendered the next year. The golden age of Greece was over. In Sparta, a reactionary oligarchy was put in place, and in Athens, democracy was suspended and replaced by the rule of 30 tyrants. Intellectuals had lost faith in democracy, and some of them hoped for the intervention of new leaders who would reunify Greek civilization. They found them, not in Athens, but to the north in Macedonia.